Welcome to everybody who's participating. Welcome to the BioEssays editorial office for the next 1 hour or so. Behind me you'll see a bookcase with, among other things, copies of BioEssays. We're still a paper publication as well as being online, of course. And our articles are published on a rolling basis online. So, my presentation is called Optimise Your Chances of Recognition by the Audiences You Are Seeking to Reach. And a lot of this presentation is indeed about thinking about your audience or your readership. And I will use both words, audience and readership, throughout the presentation, because the principles that apply to written communication apply to verbal communication as well. So you can think of your readers also as listeners. And I'm going to try and give you some insights into some of the important factors that influence the success of your paper from the point of submission to the point of publication and reading. These, of course, are not the only important things that will influence the success of your paper, but as you will see throughout the presentation, they are very important at crucial points in the progress of your paper through submission and peer review to publication. One thing I would like to make clear from the beginning as well is that what I'm saying here is only part of the work that we do in editorial, and that most of the work is involved in commissioning and coordinating peer review and really getting involved in the science of the paper involved. But we also apply techniques that come from the broad media to help scientists and also to help our journal reach the most people that it can feasibly reach. So, BioEssays is a journal in the area of cell and molecular biology, genetics, evolution, physiology, and related disciplines. We're a reviews and features journal, and I realize that many participants in this online workshop are not biologists, so I will take that into account when I give examples that have a biological background, and I will explain these examples where necessary. So I hope that's not frustrating for the biologists who understand this, and I hope that it's useful for the scientists who are listening who are not biologists. Now, I know Alicia has kindly given me a breakdown of the people attending, and they're roughly a quarter PIs, so lab heads or institution heads, and about a quarter postdocs, about a quarter PhD students, and then another quarter containing others, including undergraduates. So these are some covers of BioEssays, and my perspective is then as an in-house editor of a single journal. Now, in-house means that I work in the company. It means I get involved in all aspects of the journal and the journal development and the strategy of the journal, as well as, of course, commissioning papers and coordinating peer review and all of the usual things that an editor will do. Now, in BioEssays, we publish a lot of hypotheses as well as reviews, and we mostly commission our content. Some of it is proposed. And most of the content undergoes full peer review. Most of our articles have 2 peer review reports. Some of them have 3. On a rare occasion, they have 4. So we do thoroughly vet the content before it's published. We have an editorial board that advises and contributes ideas. And sometimes they even write articles for us. We have no executive editorial board, so we just have an advisory editorial board. The executive decisions are made here in the editorial office. And here's a little overview of some sister journals, as it were, related titles in our department and outside our department here in the rest of the Wiley company. So we have the EMBO journal, EMBO Molecular Medicine, Biology of the Cell, the European Journal of Immunology, Biotechnology Journal, and a series of journals that concentrate on bringing different disciplines together to make interdisciplinary reviews. the European Journal of Lipid Science and Technology, Starch, Molecular Nutrition and Food Research, Engineering and Life Sciences, Proteomics, Proteomics Clinical Applications, Electrophoresis, FEMS Microbiology Reviews, that's one of the journals of the Federation of European Microbiology Societies, whose journals we all of whose journals we manage at Wiley, and Stem Cells. And these journals are managed and edited by colleagues of mine within the company. So here's a rhetorical question to you, because the questions and my answers to them will come at the end of the presentation. But the question that I often ask audiences is, why do you want to publish your research? And I get many answers, and most of them are correct. And there is no single right answer. I get answers such as to let people know what I'm doing in the laboratory, or to attract funding, or to tell people that I was the first one to find out what I have just found out in my research. Another one is to attract people to my laboratory. But when scientists and engineers are surveyed, these are the results. So this is the results of a survey, or two surveys, one conducted in 1993, and the other one conducted in 2005. And the scientists and engineers were asked, what is the first, the second, and so forth, most important motivation for publishing your research? So the first motivation is in blue. I'm just going to switch to the pointer now so you can see this. So that's the first one, and that is in 1993, and the first motivation in 2005. Sorry, there it is, the first motivation in 2005. So these two columns here represent the first motivation, and clearly the most important motivation given by scientists is to disseminate their results. Of course, the other important reasons are to further their career, to attract future funding and to attract recognition for their work, and as I mentioned before, to establish precedents. But remember, the most important reason that scientists and engineers give for publishing is to disseminate their results, which means presumably they should be interested in disseminating them to the most people who would be interested. However, I see that in the way papers are written, and especially at the level of titles and abstracts and section headings, the scientists tend to minimize the readership who would understand and appreciate their research. This is where editorial comes in, and where editorial can help the scientists reach the maximum audience that is relevant to their topic. So essentially, most of my presentation will be about getting your paper noticed, and noticed in a positive sense. I'm not talking about selling your paper, or overselling your paper, or telling something that is not the truth just to get noticed. I'm talking about optimizing the language and the forms that you use for communicating what you've done, so that people really recognize what you've done, and very quickly. So here's a schematic of the process of communication from you. And here you are, working in your laboratory, through the media. So here are the media. And the media, in this sense, is really everything from popular newspapers such as The Sun in England, or Bild-Zeitung in Germany, and every country has its very popular newspapers that are quite sensationalist. So everything, the media include everything from those up to very specialist journals such as the Journal of Biological Regulators and Homeostatic Agents. That is a real journal. And these media use techniques that overlap quite a lot between publications such as the very popular media down here and the very specialist media. They basically all wish to reach as many people as they reasonably can. And that then leads to the expansion to your final audience. And these media are here to help you essentially reach that audience. This audience here might be very much greater than the audience that you typically encounter at a meeting where you talk about your subject. There could be many other people who are interested who are not so specialist and whom you wouldn't really talk to at a meeting. And journal editors can help you reach those people as well. So basically, we're talking about your largest potential audience, and this is what one journal, an academic journal, says. This is in the instructions to authors. This policy is intended to maximize the impact of your paper by making it of as wide interest as possible. This final point should therefore explain the importance of your paper in a way that is accessible to non-specialists, and that's taken from the Journal of Ecology. When you start the communication progress, think about your immediate audience. Naturally, when you're writing a paper, you also have in mind who is going to read it, because of course you're very confident that it will be published, and so you already think of the scientists who are going to read your paper. But when you start, of course, you're not communicating with those scientists, but you're communicating with an editor. And that is, the editor is your immediate audience. So try to engage that audience and subsequent audiences with the language and concepts that that audience will understand and find interesting. So this is the first key to good communication. And the first thing in an article is the title. And that, of course, is the first thing that most people see when they look up the article, or however they find it. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the theory and practice behind writing good titles, and I'll extend that also to the headings in articles, which are also very similar to titles. Here is a basic rule for a title. The involvement of protein X in signal transduction pathway Y. I put a red cross by that because I believe that is not a good title if it can be avoided. Now, this is a generic title, so for non-biologists, protein X could be anything, and it could be any signal transduction pathway. In other words, a communication pathway that communicates between the outside of the cell membrane, through to the nucleus and influences gene expression. So you could probably think of a generic title in your field that is similar to this. In other words, it contains the word involvement here, and then it has an object of scientific interest, protein X, and then it has another object of interest, pathway Y. And unfortunately, this title doesn't really tell you much about how this and this are connected and what exactly the finding of the paper is. It just says involvement. And if something more specific can be said, then involvement should not be used because it doesn't say much. And involvement is very similar to another group of words here, which also don't really say very much, because after having read the title containing one of those phrases, the reader is left with the question, what? What is the involvement? What is the effect of? What is the evidence of? What is the role of? And if the paper says something more specific, it's a good idea to try to formulate that in the title. So these are not good if you can avoid them, and this is what you should be writing if you can. So again, I've used the generic example, protein X does Z, in other words, does something, in signal transduction pathway Y. This is called an active statement because it contains a subject, protein X, a verb, does, whatever it does. It could be activates, it could be represses in signal transduction pathway Y, the object of the sentence, where protein X does its action. Okay, so this is an active statement, and you should try to use these in titles and headings throughout your manuscript, wherever you can, wherever you have something explicit to state. If you're not sure about something, and that could be also very interesting to discuss, then you can use a question form. I believe that question forms are very useful for introducing readers to topics that are problematic and still need further research, and those are very often discussed in primary articles. Another reason for which it's good to think of an active statement-like title for your article is an observation that we made a while ago about Google. There is some evidence that Google is now employing a semantic component in its algorithm, and semantic means that it is recognizing forms in language such as protein X does something. In other words, it's recognizing a syntactic form that has a meaning. And it could be that Google is also recognizing equivalences. So where it sees protein X does Y, it could also equate that with protein X upregulates protein Y. And so we believe that these semantic constructions are also recognized by Google. And that could also help the article being found, because if a user trying to search for the topic puts in a similar semantic term, in other words a statement or a question, does protein X regulate protein Y, or protein X regulates protein Y, it might be that Google is now finding equivalences in article titles. So you should try to communicate your findings, if you can, in active statement form in the title, and not like this. This is an example that I found of a title. Here is the title that uses that word influence, influences again. And I wondered, well, what does this paper really say? So I read the abstract. And as in most abstracts, you have to read to the end of the abstract down here until you find out exactly what the paper says. And here it says something quite explicit. It says, it is concluded that, especially at higher magnifications, much more surface detail is visible in biological samples when using an acceleration voltage between 2 kilovolts and 300 volts. That made me wonder, why didn't they state that in the title? So basically, here, down here, is the finding of the paper. And up here, the first thing that people read is an unspecific statement, or not a statement in fact. It's not a statement at all. So, what could we do about that title? Well, we could express the last line of the abstract, such as this. Improved detail in scanning electron microscopy of human blood platelets using acceleration voltages between 2 kilovolts and 300 volts. This isn't exactly an active statement, but it communicates a concept, it communicates the finding of the paper, and that's the most important thing. Or we could have something like this. Low acceleration voltage improves surface resolution of biological samples in scanning electron microscopy. Or we could have this. Resolution of biological scanning electron micrographs improved by using lower acceleration voltages. And that is a statement. So, as you can see, there are many ways in which you can formulate a title to convey explicitly the findings of the paper. And if you can do that, you should, because otherwise you undersell your paper. Now here's another title that I found in quite a broad journal for molecular biologists. And some of the listeners might recognize these keywords, these proteins here, and might even have some idea of the topic. So, two E3 ubiquitin ligases, SCF, SKP2, and DDB1 CUL4, target human CDT1 for proteolysis. A very, very topic-specific title. When I ask audiences who are molecular biologists what the fundamental process is that is being discussed in this article, no one knows. But, in fact, what is being discussed, and you can tell this from the abstract, is a fundamental feature of all cells. Cells divide, and that means they need to replicate their genome, their DNA. And it's very important, in most organisms at least, that when a cell divides, it doesn't replicate its genome more than once. So it needs one copy for the mother cell and a duplicate copy for the daughter cell. This is so important in biology that a mechanism that's very, very tightly controlled controls this process so that indeed the genome is only replicated once. And scientists have been studying this for a long time, and this paper reveals another piece of the puzzle. And where is it? It's at the end of the abstract. Our data unravel multiple distinct pathways regulating CDT1 to block re-replication. That is, to block re-replication of the genome when the cell divides. This process is called replication licensing, and they say that at the top of the abstract here. But you wouldn't know that from the title. And if you stumble across this article in a reference list, you also wouldn't know what this article is about. I think most molecular biologists still would not know what the core topic of this article is. So, essentially, I hope I've made the point that technically complicated and implicit titles restrict the potential readership. If you can, you should try to say something active that a broad readership in your topic area will understand. And when you're doing that, you should also think about how people are going to find your article. And increasingly, people find articles through Google, probably the most popularly used search engine in the world now. Now, I know that there are certain restrictions on Google in China, but bear in mind, of course, that everyone, or most of the people outside China, will have access to Google and will increasingly use Google to search for scientific literature. I know when I give a talk in front of a young audience, more than half of the hands go up when I ask who uses Google to find scientific articles. And we know as a company that a lot of traffic comes through Google. So here's a little bit of information on how Google works, but it's only a very little bit because we can't really know everything about how Google works, or even say more than 5%, because it's kept secret by Google for good reasons. But we do know that there are about 200 variables in the Google algorithm. And as a writer of a scientific article that goes onto the internet, you can influence maybe 4 of them. So bear the following things in mind. Google, of course, uses the frequency and the proximity of words to rank articles according to a search query. Now, you will write your article using the appropriate words with the appropriate frequency, so you probably can't optimize that. However, bear in mind that Google is probably looking at semantic constructs, in other words, constructs that have a meaning. Protein X does Y, or protein X regulates protein Y, or whatever. But it's probably recognizing these now. And therefore, you should think about using appropriate keywords and appropriate semantic connections, like statements, in your title, your subtitle, and your section headings, because Google does recognize these as distinct parts of the manuscript that influence the weighting, the search, the order of the components found in search output. So when someone puts in a term in, to search for an article in Google, the occurrence of that term in the title, subtitle, and section headings do influence the ranking of the search output. Google is probably looking at figure captions and ranking the occurrence of keywords in the figure captions as well, but we can't be sure about that. An important thing to bear in mind is that Google does not index keywords. When you write your article and you're requested by Editorial to submit between 5 and 10 keywords, these go into something called the metadata in the HTML version of the manuscript. Those metadata are not indexed by Google. So you can't think that you can make your article specific by putting in keywords alone. You have to put those keywords into the title as well. So returning briefly to the abstract, the optimal structure of an abstract actually, I will just skip over this and return to it later because we haven't yet done the abstractology. So I will return to that slide. I'm afraid I misplaced it, so my apologies for that. So basically, an explicit citation, an explicit title, will not only help your paper be found and recognized, but it might also help it be cited. And here's a piece of research that was conducted by physicists and published online in Archive. And it's called Read Before You Cite, because the research they did showed that of the commonly cited articles, only about 20% of the citations resulted from someone reading the article. In other words, in 80% of the cases of citation, the people citing the article did not read it. And they got the citation, they got the reference from another reference list of another published article. And so how did these researchers find this out? Well, they took a reference, and here's an example of a reference. This is invented, this is a real reference, but the example is chosen by me. Now, this is the correct reference, and then at some point, this reference accumulated a few errors. They are mistakes. So here you will see there is an I missing here, and genic became genetic, so it got 2 insertion mutations, and this was a substitution mutation here. The 8 got substituted for a 9. So these are a bit like genetic mutations, and so we could represent this reference as a gene with mutations in it. And so say these 4 mutations here accumulated and were recognized in 2009 by the researchers who did this study. They thought to themselves, well, those mutations in this reference are really quite specific, and we can probably follow those to see where they appear in the literature after that. And so they find that in June 2009, in another paper, this reference with exactly the same errors was found again, which means that someone basically copied the reference from here and duplicated it here. And then in subsequent publications they found the same reference with the same errors and another one that had accumulated another mutation here. And so by tracking the progress of a citation with so-called misprints, errors, they deduced that in about 80% of the cases, the papers had not been read. So they compared the occurrence of the correct reference with the incorrect reference containing these unique mutations. And that means that a lot of people are simply copying references, bibliographies. And I don't condone this as an editor. I think, of course, that all papers should be read before they're cited. But sometimes it is a shortcut taken by scientists, and that means that when they see a reference, they want to know explicitly what does this reference show. And therefore, if you have an explicit title, it's more likely that the people who read that reference will understand what it is and then they might consider reading the paper or at least citing it because it explicitly states what it presents. So let's return to that title again. The two E3 ubiquitin ligases. So we're talking here about replication licensing, the mechanism that stops the cell replicating its genome more than once when it divides. Well, I've worked on this title with different audiences, most of them PhD students and postdocs. And we've come up with things like this: limiting replication of DNA in mitosis to 1 round. 2 E3 ubiquitin ligases regulate CDT1. Excuse me. So in this title we have a very easy to understand first half. All molecular biologists will understand this. So this part here. And then in the second half we have a much more specific statement, which contains crucial keywords that experts in the field will also recognize. Another way of getting around the problem is taking advantage of a subtitle. So here is the title. This title has been reformulated in a different way, maybe for a broader readership, and that of course will depend on the journal. So the exact title will also depend on the journal and the audience that the journal reaches. So what stops DNA over-replicating in the cell cycle? Multiple pathways revealed. And then in the subtitle, we have a very specific formulation here, which contains all of the keywords of the original title. In fact, it is the original title. And there are many other ways of reformulating this title that preserve the meaning, or even make it clearer, and that also contain all of the necessary keywords. Here I've marked the keywords in brown, and here they all are. So bear this in mind. There are many, many ways of formulating a title, and if in doubt, certainly feel free to ask an editor if the editor doesn't suggest to help you. So why have a subtitle if you can? Well, here's a PubMed output, and in PubMed, you will find that the subtitle is concatenated with the title. So here is the title of a paper, Quadruplet Codons, one small step for a ribosome, one giant leap for proteins. And the subtitle, an expanded genetic code could address fundamental questions about algorithmic information, biological function, and the origins of life. So there is a piece of useful information that is very high up. The author has basically got it for free, because here you don't see the abstracts. So you have the title and the subtitle, and already you've got a lot more information in than if you just had the title. Here's a paper that doesn't have a subtitle, just the title, but it's on roughly the same topic. And in Google, the same thing happens. In other words, the subtitle is included very high in the search output. So here is the title of the paper, the X chromosome, here's the title of the paper, X chromosome located microRNAs in immunity. And then the subtitle comes down here. The X chromosome genomic context may affect X-located miRNAs and downstream signaling, thereby contributing to the enhanced immune. Well, there is a temptation to read that paper. And there are other examples. So basically, including a subtitle enables you to get a piece of useful information into the search output for free, as it were. Now, bear in mind, Google Scholar works slightly differently from Google, although it uses basically the same algorithm, and that in Google Scholar, a whole title will be displayed. So here's the whole title. It's not truncated, whereas in Google, the title is truncated. The truncation of the title in Google is another reason why it's useful to put keywords and important concepts at the front of the title. But of course, we know that relatively few people use Google Scholar to find literature. Mainly people use Google. So you should think about the way Google works when considering how to optimize your article. Here are some specific guidelines on good titles. So place your keywords up front, that is close to the beginning, and optimize them. Remember what the search engine is doing. Use keywords appropriate for reaching the intended readership. So in case there are alternative keywords that you could use, you could consider checking in the ISI Web of Knowledge to see which keyword is used more frequently in your field, and use that one. Try to state a key finding or frame a question in your titles, and keep your titles short, typically around 15 words, but don't try to keep an arbitrary limit. So if a journal says it has to be 15 or 12, try to negotiate to make sure that you can say what you want to. Use punctuation to split into a main message and qualifier if you think that's appropriate. Here's an example. So in this example, we have the concept here, returning to the stem state. It's about how somatic cells can be driven back to a stem character, how differentiated cells can be driven back to have stem cell character. And then it's qualified in the second half of the title, epigenetics of recapitulating pre-differentiation chromatin structure. Consider a subtitle if permitted. Remember what Google does with the subtitles, and also PubMed. And try if you can to think of the title before you start writing. Think what you're going to say in this paper and how to formulate it, because that will keep you on track while you're writing the paper. So we can apply titleology, the study of how titles are constructed. We can apply that to headings as well. And here's an example of a paper published in BioEssays. Here's the title. Then comes the abstract and the introduction. And then the first section after the introduction, ERK modulates BDNF signaling, a statement. And then under that, we have subsections, also with statement-like headings. BDNF expression is suppressed by mutant huntingtin. Mutant huntingtin inhibits signaling events downstream of the TRKB receptor. And so the paper continues, giving little messages at different points through headings and subheadings. And this is very useful for expressing key concepts to readers at a high level in the article, thereby allowing them to get an impression of the key insights before they start reading the body text. Okay, and now for some abstractology, study of how abstracts are written. And I start by applying some experimental psychology. And here is a curve, and here, recall means the memory of the person who is experiencing something in time t. Now this experience could be listening to a radio program, or it could be watching television, or it could be reading a chapter in a book, or it could be reading a scientific article. This is the memory of the experience, and this is time, down here. And primacy refers to the time at the beginning of the experience, and recency refers to the time at the end, in other words, the time that is most recent. And you can see from the curve that the memory of the events at the beginning of the process are much stronger than in the middle. And then the memory increases towards the end. So the events or the information towards the end of the process is also strongly remembered. And this has some consequences for how text is written in scientific manuscripts, and I apply this to the abstract now. So these are the references for the scientific papers that demonstrate this effect, if you're interested. So applying it to an abstract, it would mean that you should start the abstract with something interesting and important, and you should also end the abstract with something interesting and important. And you shouldn't put important and interesting things in the middle of the abstract, where the memory curve reaches a minimum. And it also means that you shouldn't make the abstract too long, otherwise the trough in the middle is very long. In other words, the memory is very low through a large part of the middle of the abstract. So try not to begin an abstract like this. Evolution is the key phenomenon that cuts across diverse biological systems. However, understanding remains patchy of how evolution acts in biological networks and how that action is best identified, modelled and understood. For the readers of this article, this would be a very, very well-known fact and therefore boring, and therefore a crucial point of the abstract has been missed. Try also not to start like this. Motar cilia are evolutionarily conserved cellular organelles whose periodic beating provides propulsive force for movement of fluid. All of the readers who would be targeted by this article would already know that, and hence it is a piece of information that's not novel and not particularly interesting, and therefore it shouldn't occur at the beginning of the abstract. Now, BioEssays publishes a lot in evolution, and evolution is a topic that has a number of great conundrums in it, and one is the evolution of sex and the evolution of the genetics of sex and sex chromosomes. And so here is an example, and this is not a joke, this really did appear in my email tray as a proposed article. This is how the abstract began. Sexual reproduction in mammals allows an organism to transfer part of its genes over to the next generation. Now, I don't want to use this too much as a joke because it represents a feature that is very common in scientific writing, and that is that the writer wishes to start with something that is well-known and incontrovertible, in other words, something that cannot be argued against, because it gives a very solid introduction to an article. No one can say that's not true, and therefore they read through it and already they are into the article. However, there are many more interesting ways of starting an abstract, and probably the best way is to try to express your novel thinking or finding. Now, with a knowledge of how titles are constructed, and a knowledge of the serial position effect, in other words, the memory effect, you can also consider how best to structure the rest of your manuscript. And so this leads to the concept of chunking. Now, chunking means dividing information into smaller chunks that can be more easily digested. And you can do this throughout your manuscript. So here is a big chunk, and this is a section of a manuscript. And this is hard to digest and remember because it's very long. And bear in mind the memory effect. So material in the middle of this section will not be remembered nearly as well as material at the beginning and at the end. Instead, this section could be divided like this, with a section heading. Try to use active statement form if you can, and then subheadings, also using active statement form. Each of these can be read separately by the reader, and in the mind of the reader, each of these is a separate piece of information, a chunk. And the memory effect applies now, to a certain extent, separately to these separate chunks of information, thereby increasing the memorability, the degree of memory that is left in the reader's mind, but also making all of this more easy to digest. So now we're getting towards the end of the presentation, and I'd like to emphasize the fact that there are several audiences. I think this is probably implicit by now, but as I mentioned at the beginning, your first audience is the editor. So imagine an editor receiving a letter suggesting an article for publication. Now, using the example that I used before, this is the letter that an editor could receive, and I have received some like this, so although this one is invented, it's not very far from the truth. Dear editor, I am writing to you to suggest a review with the title Involvement of the Sex-Determining Locus Binding Protein SDLB1 in the Mechanism Preventing Crossing Over Between Sex Chromosomes in Mammals, and a comparison with similar mechanisms in other vertebrates with alternatives to the simple XY system. Here is a brief summary of our paper. Sexual reproduction in mammals allows an organism to transfer to the next generation. Now, already the editor has a lot of information that is at once highly unspecific and not really accessible, and also not particularly novel and interesting. And so already the editor is not sure why he or she should consider this paper. Therefore, try and lower the barrier of understanding for the editor and try to make your topic as interesting as possible to the editor without overselling it, of course. So for the editor, if you can, try and find out the background of the editor and where has he or she studied and what is his or her speciality. Basically, in which subject area does the editor understand most? And this may seem like a minor detail, but address the editor personally, for example, Dear Dr. Smith or Dear Professor Jones. That gives the editor the impression that you are specifically interested in this journal and that you haven't just sent your letter to several editors or several editors one after the other. Write in your best English, and if possible, make sure that this English is really, really excellent, because editors don't have much time and they want to read things quickly and understand them quickly as well. Otherwise, they have to invest too much time in finding out why the paper is interesting and important. And if they have competition from other papers and the proposal is much more attractive and easy to read, then there is a competition in editorial, and the ones that are less well written are disadvantaged because we have to make decisions quite quickly and we don't know everything, of course. So try not to exceed a length of about one side of A4, because this then becomes rather too much to read and digest. Introduce the major findings with a sentence that is similar in style to a line in the abstract. For example, we have discovered a new pathway regulating replication licensing in dividing cells. Then summarize the research that you have done in a brief paragraph of not more than about 200 words, and use a language that the editor can understand. Also, very important, emphasize why your finding is novel and why it's important and suitable for that particular journal. Again, be specific. Convince the editor that you are interested in publishing specifically in that journal, and you know why you want to do that. Then, assuming your paper goes on to peer review, using the example from before, the peer reviewer would then receive a letter like this. Dear Professor Lucky, a manuscript entitled Involvement of the SDL binding protein SDLB1 in the mechanism preventing crossing over. And I won't read all of this, but you can see this is indeed the kind of letter that a reviewer would get. And then at the end of the letter would follow the abstract. And this is what the reviewer would read. Now, here again, we have to concentrate on lowering the barrier of interest for the reviewer. What is going to make the reviewer interested in this and make it easy for the reviewer to see, yes, this is interesting, I would like to review this manuscript. We basically have to put the interesting things as high up as possible in the title and in the abstract. So, if you were a reviewer in this area, you probably wouldn't be that keen on reviewing this manuscript, especially if you had others to review as well. So here's some specific advice for targeting your manuscript to peer reviewers. Bear in mind that these will be specialists in and around your field. The editor will choose those specialists because the editor needs the people who are best qualified to assess your paper. So write your title and abstract for those highly specialized researchers. So at the point of submission, when you submit your manuscript, these are the people you should be thinking about, the peer reviewers, audience, because you're past the editor at that point. So you should use keywords that these specialists will recognize and findings or concept as early as possible. Bear in mind, the invited potential reviewer only receive the title and abstract of your paper before they decide whether to review it or not. So they won't be able to make their mind up by reading your paper. They will have to go on your title and abstract. That's the only piece of information they will get. And again, make sure you write in your very best English, or use the language service. And I have some language services later on. So think of it this way: editors and authors work together, and so editors and authors can work together, and by doing so, to get recognized. And so think of it as a collaboration between you and the editor. Ask the editor questions and be receptive to suggestions that the editor makes. I occasionally rewrite a title of a paper before it goes out for peer review.
不好意思啊，刚才我们这个网络有一点点问题，那么现在我们的那个讲座继续，不好意思啊。And you can get back to your presentation.
Shall I start again? Okay. Okay, so I'll just recap a little bit. For the peer reviewers, bear in mind that the peer reviewers are specialists. So write your title and abstract for these specialists using the keywords that they will recognize, and introduce your novel findings or your concept or your idea as early as possible in the title and the abstract. Bear in mind that the invited reviewers will only get your title and abstract in order to make a decision on whether to review your article or not. And again, use your very best English. Now, editors and authors working together. So I believe that the process of publication is a collaboration between the authors on the one hand and the editors on the other. And there are many aspects in which the editors can help the authors, and you should also consider asking editors for their advice if you are in doubt about how to write something, how to phrase a title, how to construct a paper. And bear in mind that editors will be on your side, and they will be trying to optimize the readership that recognizes your paper. So work with them, and yeah. So here's an example. I, of course, would like a paper that I've decided to put into peer review to stand the best chance. And if I recognize that the title already doesn't state the finding of the paper, then I believe it's worthwhile rewriting the title before the paper goes into peer review. So here is an example. The submitted title was Chromosomal Organization of Drosophila melanogaster Genome. Now, although this doesn't have the word role of or influence of, it still doesn't say very much. It has basically chromosomal organization and then the Drosophila melanogaster genome. and it doesn't say anything really about what the paper presents as novel. But on reading the paper, I discovered that actually what the paper describes is that there is a correlation between the banding patterns in the Drosophila polytene chromosomes and the DNA binding protein occupancy. So for non-biologists, Drosophila have very large chromosomes. They are, in a sense, parallel. They are many, many copies of one chromosome bunched together, but in register. And these are found in the salivary glands. And the chromosomes are so wide that when they are stained in karyograms under the microscope, you can see banding. And what the researchers showed here was that the banding indeed correlates with the places in which DNA binding proteins bind to the chromosomes. And they had said this in the paper, but for some reason they hadn't put it in the title. So I changed the title. I checked with the authors that the new one was okay, and they said yes, that was okay. And then we put the paper into peer review. So then we get on to audience 3. We've gone through the editor, we've gone through the peer reviewers, and these are the final readers of your paper. And this is just an example that I've made up. It's a little bit of a joke. I apologize if it's not funny, but basically this is a journal that I made up that decided to accept this manuscript without much change. And there's the title. And then it starts with this very well-known concept, and it even has a nice figure to demonstrate it as well. This is a bit of an extreme example, I know, but it's not too far from the truth of what might happen with some manuscripts if they weren't optimized. Instead, this manuscript could appear like this when it's published, with a very explicit title: SDLB1 triggers suppression of crossing over between sex chromosomes, and then a qualification with a suggestion of something very interesting: a clue to the evolution of sex chromosome systems, ? And then in the abstract, right up front, the authors say what they've discovered. We have identified a protein that binds to the sex-determining locus on mammalian Y chromosomes and prevents crossing over of the majority of the Y chromosome with the X chromosome during meiosis. Now, I'd like to say this is an example I have made up. It's not scientifically correct. It's just to demonstrate the point that there are many, many different ways in which an article can go through editorial and come out at the other end. And there's a lot that can be done in optimization between the worst case scenario, which is this, and the best case scenario, which is this. So, just looking at the titles once again, title optimization is not a one-off exercise because, as you can see, there are many audiences. For the editor, you might want to think of a very simple title that expresses the novel finding in a way that the editor can understand, such as this. And then for the reviewers, when you submit the paper, you want quite a specific title with keywords that the reviewers will recognize. And for the final readership, work together with the editor to formulate a title that will reach your optimal audience and that won't cut out whole sections of the scientific community because they don't understand the title or the abstract. Here are the take-home messages. So this is the final slide. Think of your immediate audience or your readership before starting the communication process. What do they know? What do they not know? What interests them? And what language do they understand? What kind of scientific language do they understand? Try to state your findings in active statement form. And state your novel findings early in the title, abstract, and sections. Break longer sections up into shorter subsections and apply a knowledge of the serial position effect to optimize memory formation in your readers. Optimize your use of keywords for the readers you aim to reach. Work with editors to optimize your article for findability via search engines and recognition and recall by the final readers. And I can't state it more emphatically, write in your best English at all stages. I know that some people say, well, science should speak for itself, but the quality of the English does have a big effect on the ease with which people read and appreciate your science. And on the Wiley website, Author Services, we have a list of language services that can help you there. Well, that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Now I'm open to questions to which I hope to be able to give some answers.